Hey everyone, and welcome to our first online lecture. So I'm going to try to keep this the same as we do in class. So you'll see the questions as we go through, I'll answer them. I'm going to try to keep it exactly like it would be in person. If you need to, pause the video, take notes, come back to it later, finish it. But just like before, these are the questions you're going to see on the test. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So today we're talking about the war in Europe, and we're going to back up from just a little bit where we have America enter the war, and we're going to go back to June of 1941. That's about 6 months before the Americans enter. In June of 1941, we're going to see Operation Barbarossa. So this is Germany launching an invasion into the Soviet Union, and you can see it starts in June, but in the picture I have here, we have our German soldiers still in Russia by the time winter hits. So they weren't prepared for what they're going to see there. At the time when they're attacking Russia, this is the largest, most well-trained army that we have ever seen. In world history, this is the biggest and best one. But they're not prepared for the elements that they encounter in Russia. Some historians point to this as being Hitler's first real mistake, trying to invade Russia and then getting stuck there in the winter. Other historians are going to point to him declaring war on the United States. But between those two actions taken in 1941, the war is going to start turning and start going more in the Allies' favor. So like I said, June is Operation Barbarossa, and then right after Pearl Harbor, Hitler declares war on the United States. He does this because he's already formed an alliance with Italy and Japan, but he did not have to. Now, once he has declared war on the United States, we are then able to turn around and declare war on Germany. That's going to allow the United States to really focus on that plan that Roosevelt and Churchill had created before that said Germany first. We're going to focus on Germany, then Italy, then Japan. All right, so after the German declaration of war, we are going to see the United Nations Declaration. Now, we don't quite have the actual United Nations yet that we think of today. We don't have the UN, but this is really going to consolidate our alliance. So in this United Nations Declaration, 26 nations are going to pledge to use basically all of their resources to fight Hitlerism. And again, remember Roosevelt had talked before about how we are not at war with Germans, we're at war with Nazism. So it's a little bit of a different terminology, but it's the same basic idea. The United Nations Declaration is built on the principles that we had in the Atlantic Charter, and this really is just making the Allies a strong force with a common goal. The next major thing that we're going to see in this war is going to be the Battle of Leningrad. So this is going to go on for the majority of the rest of the war. Leningrad is an important city in Russia due to the Baltic Fleet, due to its location, but it also has an emotional significance because it's named for Lenin, one of their country's founders. During the Battle of Leningrad, it's estimated that about 1 million residents are going to lose their lives, and ones that don't lose their lives are forced to flee over ice at various points in time. This is also going to be the hometown of Vladimir Putin. So a lot of psychologists, a lot of people that do that kind of research have looked into how this being his hometown has affected his world outlook and possibly how it has affected the way that he views other Western nations. So even though it's not super important to us right now at this point in time, I want you guys to be aware of that. All right, for the United States, when we go into the European theater, our commanding general is going to be Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower has spent his entire life, adult life, in the military. He is somebody who has a lot of experience and a lot of training, but he's never actually seen warfare. So World War II will be his first time in combat. By the end of the war, he'll be charged of not just the Americans, but also the English, the French, and the rest of the Western Allied forces. His title by the end of the war is going to be Supreme Commander. One of the first actions Eisenhower is going to engage in is something called Operation Torch. Operation Torch is created due to the fighting that's happening in North Africa. Within North Africa, we have some French troops and Italian and German troops that are locked in a stalemate. We need those French troops to come with us when we launch an invasion into Germany. We're going to need all the forces we can get. So these are men that have seen combat, they're battle ready. They're just stuck right now in this stalemate. So Operation Torch is designed to free up those French troops and then that we can take them with us when we go into Europe. So the really significant battle here during Operation Torch is going to be the Battle of El Alamein. This is going to take place from October to November of 1942. When Hitler and his troops first marched into northern Africa, part of his goal is to add Egypt to his empire. So what Alexander the Great was trying to do, what Napoleon is trying to do, Hitler is now trying to do, to create this new world empire under the German flag. When the American troops show up, we are able, because of our numbers and because we are fresh to the fight, halt the German advance and the Italian troops that are with the Germans. So by the end of this battle, 275,000 Germans surrender, we take them as prisoners of war, and now we have freed up some of those French troops to go with us when we go back into Europe proper. This battle is one of many that, like I said, we end up with a lot of POWs, prisoners of war. So there is a clause in the Geneva Conventions that talks about prisoners of war and how you treat them. You guys probably know most of them. You have to feed them, house them, clothe them. You have to offer them medical attention. You can't interrogate them. You can't torture them. But there are some other things in there that are a little bit less known. So one of the clauses in the Geneva Conventions is that if you capture a prisoner of war, you have to house them in the same climate as what you captured them in. So the idea is that most people are going to be fighting close to home. This is outdated, but the idea was most people are going to be fighting close to home, and they're going to be captured in a climate that's similar to their home climate. That's not the case in this situation, but the articles say that we have to house them in a climate similar to North Africa. So when we get back to the United States, we're looking for open land to house prisoners of war, and we think the climate of North Africa is hot, so we need someplace hot. So as you guys might imagine, Texas is going to end up with a lot of these prisoners of war camps. You can see this map of where the prisoner of war camps are throughout the United States, and Texas has a good percentage of them. What we're also going to see in Texas for these Germans that we've captured is that they're treated pretty well. They're fed well. They're not used as slave labor. They do have the option to work if they want to, and they're paid very little, but they are paid. They can rent themselves out to do some farm work or to work in those very small towns that are by these POW camps. Because these troops are treated so well, in Texas we start referring to these camps as the Fritz Ritz. So Fritz being kind of like a generic name for Germans, and Ritz meaning fancy hotel. So the Fritz Ritz. When the war is over, we do have to send all of our POWs back to their home countries, in this case back to Germany. Some of them, once they get back to Germany, decide to immigrate to the United States because they enjoyed their time in Texas. And so that's an interesting back and forth that we're going to see for the next few years after the war is over. The next important thing that's going to happen is not a battle, but it's something that we need to be paying attention to. So in January of 1943, we are going to have a meeting at Casablanca. This is a meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt. So they've already met once informally. This is our first big formal meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt. And what they're going to do is essentially formalize the Atlantic Charter. So during this discussion, we agree with the British that we're going to seek support from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's already asked to join the alliance. This is a formal recognition that we need their help, and they need our help. We are going to acknowledge the Free French, so the French that have fled from German occupation or the French that are holding territories independently. They're going to become part of our allies. We also agree that our basis for ending the war is the unconditional surrender of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Unconditional means that the countries that are surrendering don't get to set any conditions. They don't get to say, we're going to surrender, but they just have to surrender. So we could reorganize their government. We could take away their army. We could divide up their lands in a different way. When they surrender, we will have complete and total control over those countries. We see that as necessary because we see Germany particularly as being a dangerous nation. Germany had to sign the Treaty of Versailles that said that they caused World War I. We know that that's historically not true. That's a historical fiction. They'll claim they owned it and they started it. Germany absolutely is the cause of World War II. So we think that if we don't have an unconditional surrender and we allow Germany to just keep being Germany, they will lead us into World War III. So this is a preventative measure to avoid future wars when this war is over. Unconditional surrender doesn't mean that we are going to execute every German male. It doesn't mean that we're going to put Germans in work camps or slave camps. It essentially means that we're going to destroy the governments of those countries, but not the people or the populations of those countries. Again, Roosevelt's going to be pretty firm here that we are at a war with Nazism, not with the German people. One more thing before we move on, I want you guys to look at this picture. And I want you to notice that both Roosevelt and Churchill are seated. That's a courtesy to Roosevelt. So Churchill's also seated so that Roosevelt doesn't stand out for having to be in the wheelchair. But in this picture, I think Roosevelt actually looks probably a little bit more healthy than Churchill does. That's deceiving because Roosevelt is beginning to decline. His health is going to get worse and worse and worse as we go on. So as we keep going back to these meetings and I keep showing you guys pictures of Roosevelt, I want you to be watching that and paying attention to that. All right, our next big battle is going to be the Battle of Stalingrad. So this is going to be January to February of 1943. This is as far into Russia as Germany is ever going to get. And again, I want you guys to notice the snow and the weather because the Germans are not prepared for that. This is the first major loss for the Germans in World War II. We're talking about major loss. We're talking about significant number of lives lost. They've lost battles before this, but not in this great of number and not in this many people killed. This is a real blow to German morale. Germans have only been hearing the news from their government, and they're not getting any outside media. So everything's been celebrated as a victory up to this point. And then we have Stalingrad. Hitler actually tries to contain the news of this loss. He tries to make sure the media doesn't report it. He tries to make sure that this doesn't get out. But it does just because too many people had loved ones that died that he couldn't hide it. And so by the end of the Battle of Stalingrad, this becomes a major PR issue for the Germans. Some people begin to think like there's nothing we can do. We might lose this war at this point. Not everybody in Germany, but quite a few of them. All right, the next major event we're going to see is the Italian invasion. So in 1943, the Italians, primarily the British and the Americans, begin their invasion of Italy. This invasion is going to be over pretty quickly. A lot of Italians are not happy with Mussolini's government. They have been looking for a time and a place to overthrow him, and this is going to be it. So once the Allied forces are in Sicily, we're going to see a full-scale collapse of Mussolini's government. On July 25th of 1943, he is going to be arrested, and he's put in jail. What you're seeing in this picture on this page is going to happen a little bit later when some people that are loyal to him and some Germans actually help him break out of jail. They help him escape, and they're going to take him to northern Italy and put him in charge of a puppet German government in the north. Once the Americans have a foothold in southern Italy, Italians are going to be offered leniency if they aid in fighting the Germans. So we're offering Italy the chance to do in World War II what they did in World War I. We're offering them the chance to flip sides, and most Italians are going to do that. That's one reason why at the end of the war, the occupation of Italy is much less harsh than the occupation of Germany and the occupation of Japan. We are going to view Italy as having been misled by this one really terrible ruler, whereas Germany, we're going to blame a lot more for Nazism collectively. In July of 1943, as the invasion of Italy is ongoing, we're going to see Operation Gomorrah. So this is the first time the Allies take a bombing campaign to Germany. If you guys remember back to a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the German bombing in London, the Blitz, and how terrible that was. There had been this feeling in Germany that their air force was so strong that those bombing campaigns could not come back to them. that they could bomb other countries, they wouldn't get bombed. Operation Gomorrah is going to turn that on its head. So the target here is going to be a port city called Hamburg. This is the first joint operation between the Royal Air Force and the United States newly created Air Force, and it's very, very successful. By the end of this operation, 1 million residents in Hamburg have lost their homes, and between 40 to 50,000 have been killed. The fact that that bombing can now come to Germany and that Germans are losing their homes and Germans are losing their lives is really going to shake the confidence that a lot of Germans have in this war. And when the people start questioning whether or not they're going to win, all right, in November of 1943, we are going to have the first big meeting between Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. And this is going to take place in Tehran. So this is in Soviet territory. The British and American contingencies have to travel to Soviet territory to have this meeting. Churchill is very, very reluctant to go. He does not agree to stay in the Soviet hotel that's been set up for them. He's going to find his own accommodations, and the British diplomats are going to stay with him. Roosevelt, on the other hand, does stay in the Soviet hotel. Churchill's concern is that that hotel has probably been bugged, and that Stalin will be listening to everything they say. So when Roosevelt stays at this hotel, and he's meeting with the American diplomats every night after all of these meetings during the day, and they're debriefing, he would say things like, oh, Stalin is so smart. Stalin had this great idea today. Oh, Stalin said this amazing thing because he knows that the rooms are bugged too. He's playing into Stalin's ego. So Roosevelt and Stalin are able to build, if not a trusting relationship, at least a working relationship during this time. By the end of the meetings in Tehran, we have the Allies reaffirm their commitment to an unconditional surrender, and the Soviets sign off on that. So we're going to have an unconditional surrender from the Axis powers. And we agree that the defeated nations are going to be occupied. Maybe not permanently, maybe not forever, but we're going to create zones of occupation. So the Americans are going to occupy, the British are going to occupy, and the Soviets are going to occupy. The idea is not to create an empire. It's not to set up territories or provinces. The idea is that we're going to remove the dangerous elements in those places, return them to normal, and then they will be given self-rule. So at this point, that's what everybody's agreeing to. Now, it doesn't end up working that way, but that's where we're at this point. All right, in June of 1944, we're going to see Operation Overlord. The Operation Overlord is D-Day. This is the operational name for the major landing in northern France, and from northern France, we're going to march into Germany. The plan for D-Day, we have 36 different nations coordinating here, using all different kinds of boats, all different kinds of carriers, all different kinds of vessels. We know that there's going to be a high loss of life on D-Day. We have men going from a bigger boat to a small boat, then to land as close as we can get, jumping out with guns and packs, running through the ocean, running through wet sand, all while Germans are shooting at them. We know there's going to be a high loss of life. What we're hoping is that there are so many people that we're going to overwhelm the Germans. The loss of life won't matter just because there's so many people participating in this invasion. The person in charge of the entire operation is going to be Dwight Eisenhower, and he's the person that picks the day and gives the call to go. So this is a picture from the invasion of Normandy, D-Day. D-Day does actually take place over 2 days, just because there's so many people. This is a picture from day 2. We did try to take pictures and videos from day 1, but they're so bloody that the United States doesn't want to show them. When we talk about generally the seas are red with blood or the streets are red with blood, usually that's a metaphor. In D-Day, it's not. Literally, the ocean is red from the amount of blood that's in the ocean. This is a picture from day 1 of Normandy, and you can see how many people have been shot and killed, how the medics are tending to people. It's more chaotic. If you were going to be in the D-Day invasion, it was safer to be in day 2. One thing I want to point out before we move on is the white armbands with the crosses. Those are medics. So no matter how bad the fighting in Europe gets, we still have the general rules of war maintained, meaning that medics are not specifically targeted by the infantry or by snipers. That's not going to be true when we get to the Pacific Theater. So this is something to pay attention to when you listen to the next lecture and we're talking about what's going on more in Asia. All right, so the plan is from Normandy to move to Paris, and then we're going to regroup in Paris, and then from Paris to move into Germany. The push into Germany is going to be the Battle of the Bulge. So this is going to take place from December of 1944 to January of 1945. This is the last major offensive for the Germans. This is the last major offense for the Germans. This is the last time they're able to launch a major campaign. But for us, the significance for our class is this is what's going to push the United States into Germany. This is where we're going to cross that border and then begin our march to Berlin. At this point, January of 1945, it looks very, very probable that the United States and the Allies are going to win this war. It seems to be just a matter of time until the Germans are forced to surrender. We're going to have one more meeting as we see the war is starting to wind down. And this is going to be at Yalta in February of 1945. So again, looking at this picture, you've got Churchill, you've got Stalin, and then there's Roosevelt. And you can see by this point, Roosevelt is not looking well. Roosevelt's doctor actually told him in 1944 that he should not run for president again. He has just won and he's just ran and won, so he's entering his 4th term as president. But his doctor has said that it's very unlikely he'll live to the end of his 4th term. He's pretty sick by this point. At Yalta, because again, it looks like the Allies are going to win this war, we again are going to reassert the idea that only unconditional surrender is accepted. Roosevelt is going to make us again commit to the idea that Germany is not the enemy, that Nazism is the enemy, and we agreed that we're going to demilitarize and denazify Germany when the war's over. We do find that Germany is going to have to pay for this war. So Germany is going to owe war reparations. These are not going to be as extreme as in World War I, so it's not a monetary amount, but it's going to be in terms of labor and intellect. There are going to be scientists that are taken by both sides so that Germany can pay off part of their war debt that way. We agree at this meeting that Germany is going to be divided in 3 zones. Now, we're later going to amend that and make it 4 zones, but at this point, we agree that Germany is going to be divided into 3 zones, with the Americans, the British, and the Soviets all getting a piece of Germany. Berlin is in the Soviet side of Germany, but we're also going to divide the city of Berlin. So there will be an American, a British, and a Soviet occupation within the city of Berlin, and then that city will be in the Soviet side of Germany. We also declare that all displaced civilians would be returned to their countries of origin. By this point, again, we found the camps, we've begun liberating people, we're trying to get them healthy enough to be returned home. This is our commitment that we're going to move them from those camps we found them in back to their home countries. Not all will return to their home countries, some don't want to. So that's another issue we're going to have to deal with at the end of the war. But we have committed that we will help them return should they want to. Before we leave Yalta, we also decide that the Americans and the Soviet forces should reach Berlin at relatively the same amount of time. We haven't had a sighting of Hitler in a while. He's gone underground, literally. He's in a bunker. So we don't know exactly where he is, but we believe that he's in Berlin. So if that's the place where Hitler is, we know that Berlin's going to be a pretty heavy fight. So there is an agreement that we're going to get there at roughly the same time. And that's not going to play out exactly that way, but hold on to that for a moment. All right, as we're getting ready for that final push, as we're getting ready to really move into Berlin, Roosevelt's going to die. Roosevelt dies on April 12th of 1945. So when President Roosevelt dies, Vice President Harry Truman now becomes president. Truman's only been vice president for about 80 days. He wasn't the vice president the first 3 terms. He was a senator. So when he becomes president, there's a very, very quick shift that happens. You would think, as sick as Roosevelt was, that he would have been sharing a lot of information with Truman, But Roosevelt didn't operate that way. He liked to keep everything compartmentalized as much as possible. So when Truman becomes president, he really has to be filled in by the military on a bunch of things really, really quick, especially because we're winding down the war in Europe. The other thing that Truman has to be made aware of is the Manhattan Project, which we'll talk more about when we talk about the war in Asia. But if you can imagine, Truman goes from knowing absolutely nothing to, over a weekend, being told, you're going to have to help us decide how Europe looks when the war ends. We're going to occupy Germany, and we have some atomic bombs, and you have to decide if we're dropping them or not. So there is a period of a few days where there's not much action from Truman, and some historians have criticized him for that. But I think given the amount of information he's given in a very short time, that makes a lot of sense why we see kind of a slow reaction from Truman at first. By April 25th, we're seeing the beginning of the battle for Berlin. The Soviets do make it into Berlin before the American forces. This is not an accident. So again, Dwight Eisenhower is in charge of those Allied forces marching to Berlin. At this point, Eisenhower's not a politician. Later, he's going to be president, but he's not a politician at this point. So when he looks at a map and he sees that Berlin is in the Soviet side of Germany, he's going to make the choice to purposely slow down the American and Allied forces. He's going to let the Soviets get there first. He's going to let them take a majority of the casualties for Berlin, and then we will show up and help finish the battle. But he doesn't see any reason to lose Allied or American soldiers for something that, in his mind, the Soviets are eventually going to own. Now, he's not going to say that out loud. What he says out loud is that we don't want to outpace our supply lines. We don't want to get the troops further and farther away than we can get the food, which makes sense, which completely and totally makes sense. But we could have informed the Soviets if that was the case. The fact that we purposely do not inform them of the slowdown calls that reasoning into question. All right, so on April 28th, Mussolini is caught trying to sneak out of northern Italy, and it's Italian forces that find him. They are going to kill both him and his mistress, and they're going to string them up. They put the bodies up at what basically amounts to like a gas station, and they leave the bodies there for a few days. And that's supposed to be a show to the Americans and to the Allied forces that they have completely turned against Mussolini, that they blame him for what happened to their country and for them being misled. And to some extent, again, that's going to work. We are going to treat them in a much, much more lenient fashion than we treat the Japanese or the Germans. All right, right after Mussolini's death, very end of April, we see the final fall of Berlin. We see Soviet occupation first. Of course, the Americans are going to be right there behind them. And then we also get word on April 30th that Hitler has committed suicide. So Hitler and his top leaders in the bunker all commit suicide. His wife, Eva Braun, I think they've been married at this point about 12 hours, is also going to commit suicide. There are these rumors that we'll hear sometimes of like Hitler's living in Argentina or Hitler made it out of Berlin. The reason that those rumors develop is because when the Soviets found the body, which had been burned, when the Soviets find the body, they won't give it to the Americans and they won't show it to the Americans. This is a little bit of payback for us not being there right when the Battle of Berlin started. Since the 1990s, they actually have let us see the body. We've done some DNA testing on the body. We know that this actually is the body. So Hitler is dead. There's no question about that. He committed suicide in the bunker in 1945. So as soon as Hitler is dead, there's going to rush to form a new German government. A new German government is created, and that German government is going to surrender. Italy is also going to formally surrender. And so on May 8th, 1945, we have VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. So if you guys have seen the photo of the nurse and the sailor kissing in Times Square, this is sort of the equivalent, the European equivalent to that. This marks the end of the war for Europe. Now, this isn't the end of our war. We are still fighting the Japanese. And our expectation is that our allies will be going with to fight the Japanese. The French say they're happy to go with us, but it's going to take them about 2 years to get their army up and ready. The British say it's going to take them about 12 months to reorganize and to be ready. The Soviets say they will be ready to go fight Japan by August of 1945. So they just need about 3 months and they're going to come help us. Out of all of our allies, that the Russians would come help us surprises us. But we should look at that sort of critically. We think, okay, the Russians are the only one really honoring this agreement that we're all going to fight to the end, this unconditional surrender. Or we can remember that in 1906, Russia and Japan fought a war and Russia lost. And so maybe this really isn't about helping the Americans. Maybe some of this is about revenge for Russia. But either way, the Russians say give them to August, and they are going to be with us in Japan. For Germany, what we're going to see after the war is that Germany is divided. So we end up with actually a 4-part occupation at first. We'll have the Americans, the British, and the French occupying West Germany, and then East Germany will be occupied by the Soviets. We're going to see those as 2 completely separate countries. We have Germany and West Germany until the 1990s. That's how long it is before we trust Germany to reunite and to become a country that won't commit World War III. Within Berlin, we're also going to see a division, West Berlin and East Berlin. West Berlin will be a democracy occupied by the French, Americans, and the British. East Berlin is eventually going to be part of the Soviet bloc. So they're going to have communism. It's a very interesting situation because you could go from East Berlin, put yourself on a subway and end up in West Berlin and in a democracy, and from there fly out. And if you were a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher or a profession that could make a lot of money, it made sense to leave the Soviet bloc via West Berlin and go to one of the democracies. To keep that from happening, eventually we're going to see the Berlin Wall. We'll talk about that more later when we talk with. We'll talk about that more later when we get to Kennedy. But for right now, I want you guys to see that that's already becoming an issue. The idea that there is this little oasis of democratic capitalism within the Soviet bloc is going to be a problem. Those tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1945, we can already start to see them. We're not quite to the Cold War yet, but we're not that far from it either. All right, so that was the war in Europe. If you guys have any questions, email me, let me know. But if you're ready, you can go ahead and go on to the next lecture, which is going to be the war in Asia.